License, registration, or just some good excuses, old man? The young officer sneered as he circled the rusty truck, chuckling with his partner. The driver didn't argue. He didn't even look up. He just kept both hands on the wheel, calm, silent, and covered in scars. 1 hour later, a black SUV pulled up, and when the four-star general stepped out, he didn't salute. He simply pointed at the officers and said 6 words, "You just stopped the man who trained me." If that moves something in you, leave a comment to honor all the silent legends still walking among us. Harold Briggs, 81 years old, was just heading home from the hardware store. His old truck rattled through every turn, but it kept moving because he'd built it himself with his own hands. That quiet street corner on that morning was nothing special until a beat-up old truck, paint peeling and tailgate clanking, pulled off under the flashing lights of a police cruiser. It all began with a voice that carried more mockery than command. License, registration, or just a few excuses today? A question that might have sounded routine, except it wasn't. Not with the way it was spoken, the doubting glare, the smirking laughter of the young cop. There was no respect, no caution, just judgment cast on an elderly man driving a worn-out vehicle through a quiet town. Leonard Hayes, obsessional, didn't resist. He didn't argue. He didn't even return the disrespect. Instead, he kept his hands on the wheel, spine straight, eyes focused forward. That calm wasn't weakness. It was the strength of a man who had survived battlefields, who understood the power of silence in the face of ignorance. The Ford F-100 he drove wasn't just transportation. It was memory made metal. Years of service in special operations, midnight supply runs through flooded marshes, rides carrying wounded brothers back to base. But none of that mattered to the 2 officers. To them, all they saw was faded paint and missing paperwork. The mistake didn't begin with a violation, it began with an attitude. When power rests on the shoulders of someone who hasn't yet learned respect, misjudgment becomes fuel for disgrace. And in a moment where a simple greeting would have sufficed, they chose suspicion. They chose ridicule. The old Ford F-100 sat silently in the middle of the road, like an unwilling witness to something it didn't deserve. The 2 young officers circled it once more this time, not just with suspicious eyes, but with hands that began to search every corner. They opened the doors, checked the compartments, pulled out item after item, a tool bag, an old toolbox, a few pieces of lumber, and a worn notebook tucked between some documents and black and white photographs. "What's this? Secret codes or something?" The taller officer laughed, flipping through the yellowed pages. Inside were hundreds of handwritten names, some marked with stars, others crossed out. No explanations, just names off the living, the fallen, or the forever missing. "Those are the names of the men I served with," Leonard answered calmly, without a trace of anger. "Sounds like something out of a war movie," the other officer chuckled, tossing the notebook back onto the seat like it was scrap paper. But they didn't stop there. In the glove compartment, they found a Bronze Star citation and a farewell letter signed by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Neither of them read carefully. They didn't ask questions. They just glanced at each other and shrugged. "And here's another one," the young officer muttered, holding up an old photograph of Leonard in full combat uniform, standing among a squad of grim-faced black berets. "Were you the lead in Rambo 5 or something?" he joked, flashing the photo to his partner. Leonard said nothing. He remained still, eyes fixed on a distant point not in the sky, but in a forest somewhere in Panama, where he once dug through dirt and gunfire to pull 3 wounded soldiers to safety. That memory didn't need to be spoken, and it couldn't be understood by someone who only glanced at it. Each piece of proof from a life of service was discovered and dismissed. Not because it was missing, but because those who found it lacked the depth to recognize it. They didn't know, and worse, they didn't care to. This was no longer about simple disrespect. It was the danger of power in the hands of the ignorant. And when battlefield memories are tossed aside like candy wrappers, a quiet question begins to stir in the reader's mind. When did we forget how to recognize a hero? Time seemed to slow in the sweltering heat of the southern noon. Leonard Hayes sat on the curb, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes gazing into the distance, as if untouched by the 2 officers still whispering a few feet away. Bystanders posed. Some pulled out their phones to quietly record. No one knew exactly what was happening, but everyone felt something wasn't right. And then, the wind shifted. The soft crunch of large tires rolled across the cracked pavement. A sleek black SUV turned the corner at a steady but deliberate pace. Government plates. Tinted windows reflecting the sun. The two officers turned, visibly uneasy. One murmured, "Feds? That was fast." "FBI, maybe?" the other whispered. Both were wrong. The rear door opened. A pair of gleaming leather shoes stepped onto the ground, followed by a tall man in full military dress, decorated with medals, 4 stars glinting on his shoulders. He didn't rush, but with every step, the air grew heavier. He stopped in front of the officers, no salute, no introduction. His gaze pierced through their sunglasses, paused for just a second, then pointed directly at Leonard. "Which one of you pulled over that man?" The 2 officers straightened up, startled. "We were just following protocol," the younger stammered, unsure. The general cut him off. His voice dropped each word, striking the scorching pavement like a hammer. "You just stopped the man who trained me." MD. The entire street fell silent. The murmurs died. Every eye turned to Leonard, the man now revealed to be the teacher of a 4-star general. He still sat there, serene, as if none of what had just unfolded needed defending. No further explanation was necessary. His true identity, and every unanswered question, had been answered. And in that moment, the story changed. It was no longer a traffic stop. It was the moment America realized it had underestimated a living legend. No one was laughing anymore. As General Matthew Collins stood beneath the scorching southern sun, his solemn face steady, the same eyes that once looked at Leonard Hayes with doubt now held a different kind of silence, the silence of regret. The general didn't need to shout to command presence. His voice was low and firm, each word landing like a gavel striking memory. He once led a lost rescue unit through the forests of Panama in 1986. If it hadn't been for him, the young, panicked rookies we were back then, we wouldn't be standing here today. He looked directly at the 2 young officers, not with anger, but with a kind of truth-laced compassion. Sometimes medals aren't pinned on chests, they're etched in scars and silence. Leonard remained quiet, but when the general stepped forward and bowed his head, Leonard's lake-still eyes trembled just slightly. Then, in a voice slow and firm, he spoke. "Permission to stand, sir?" "Permission granted, Sergeant Hayes," the general replied, unable to hide the deep respect in his voice. Only then did the crowd fully realize. That old Ford F-100 wasn't just a vehicle. It was a witness to a life of service. A woman near the front gasped, moved. "He built the ramp at my house for free." Another added, "Every summer, he teaches the kids survival skills. Never boast, never accepts thanks." That rusty old truck, dismissed by many as scrap, had once hauled medical supplies into flooded neighborhoods after Hurricane Katrina, towed an ambulance stuck in a Montana blizzard, and quietly delivered wood, cement, and medical gear to people no one else remembered. Leonard didn't keep it for the memories. He kept it because he was still using it, just like himself, aged but never finished. The general signaled to his aide. The man stepped forward and handed the officers a folder stamped with the Department of Defense seal. "This is his service record, classified. Read it before your shift ends today." No one responded, not out of fear, but because there was nothing left to say. Police don't argue with the military, but more importantly, they couldn't argue with the truth. And the truth was this: Leonard Hayes didn't need a spotlight. He was the light. From that moment forward, he wasn't just the old man in the rusty truck. He became a living symbol of duty, sacrifice, and the respect a decent society must never forget. There were no more whispers, no more mocking glances, no more smug laughter. That little corner of town fell into hush as the final pieces of the truth came into view. The 2 young officers now stood frozen, not by orders, but by conscience. General Collins kept his gaze steady, but instead of continuing the reprimand, he turned to Leonard and asked in a somber tone, "Sergeant Hayes, do you have anything you'd like to say to them?" Leonard slowly turned. His eyes didn't hold anger, only the weariness of a man who had seen this too many times before. The gap between authority and understanding, between uniformity and character. "Don't apologize to me," he said, voice raspy but clear. "Apologize to the next elderly person you stop before assuming they're nobody." It wasn't a lecture. It was a reminder. Dignity is not something earned after proving your worth. It's something you owe people from the start. The younger officer, the one who joked about him being washed up, Rambo, stepped forward. Gone was the smugness. He took off his sunglasses, eyes red, and whispered, "I didn't know. I truly didn't know." Leonard nodded. "That's the problem. You didn't know, but you never tried to." The general stepped in, placing a firm hand on the officer's shoulder. I used to be a rookie just like you, and I'm only alive today because of him. Don't let ignorance be a stain on your oath to protect. The silence softened. Some in the crowd bowed their heads. Others wiped away tears. Leonard's words, gentle but piercing, rang out like a bell in a world too quick to judge. From that moment on, those two officers no longer saw an old man in a beat-up truck. They saw a man with a history, a legacy, and a dignity that no ID or license plate could measure. And that was a lesson no academy could teach. Only life and respect could awaken it. From a misunderstood street corner to the heart of a town's reverence, Leonard Hayes didn't step into the light with speeches or shiny medals. He stepped in with patience, quiet dignity, and unwavering service. And just like he once rescued young soldiers in the Panamanian jungle, this time he rescued a whole community from its indifference. The story spread like wildfire. Footage of a 4-star general bowing to an 81-year-old veteran went viral within days. The phrase, "You never know who you're stopping," became a national slogan, not just on social media, but in policy and behavior. The day Leonard Hayes was proclaimed by the mayor of Wilmot, a promise that respect is not just a feeling, it must be an action. In just 1 week, a community fund raised over $240,000, all of which Leonard donated to building ramps and repairing homes for veterans and the disabled. But the true impact wasn't in the dollars, it was in the quiet awakening that followed. New police recruits were now required to read Leonard's service file and training. One of the officers, Brian Keller, not only apologized, but began volunteering every weekend at the local Veterans Center, listening, helping, becoming part of the community he once overlooked. Leonard never sought recognition. When asked why he still drove that old truck and worked every day, he simply said, "Because there's still someone out there who needs help, and I can still walk." There were no grand speeches, no stage lights, but in that simplicity, he left behind a legacy no medal could match. A legacy of respect, resilience, and how one quiet man can transform a generation. Every morning, the old Ford F-100 rumbles down Wilmot's main avenue, still growling softly, still rattling in the back with a few planks, some tools, or sometimes a neatly folded American flag, ready for a veteran with no family, awaiting his final rest. But now, when people see it, they no longer look past Leonard Hayes. They make way and bow. Not because the truck got a new paint job, not because the man wears medals, but because from that day on, he became a living reminder. A person's worth is never found in appearances. At the street corner where it all happened, a small bronze plaque was mounted on the lamppost. 6 words, etched deep and clear: "You never know who you're stopping." End of chapter. And at the local police academy, every recruit must read his story, not just to understand valor, but to learn patience, to learn how to respect someone before you know who they are. Leonard Hayes never went on television, never gave speeches, never chased spotlights. He went back to his old truck, his quiet work, and the shoes worn thin from a lifetime of walking. But in that humility, he left an immortal legacy, a lasting reminder that kindness doesn't need a stage, and respect should never arrive too late. Because people like Leonard don't live for applause. They live to serve, and they leave behind light for those who pause long enough to see it.